Welcome to another episode on the Law Report. Today, I'm going to talk a little about video that was circulating on the internet, and it ended up in my WhatsApp inbox. And what I can see from the video is a bunch of law enforcement officers. I think it has now been verified that they are border force enforcement officers beating, for want of a better description, the living daylights out of a man. So there has been a debate raging about excessive force and whether it was justified and what happened before, etc. I want to discuss it. I'll be back shortly to talk about that matter. But before I get into it, I will discuss the law and the use of force in relation to law enforcement officers.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to speak to an attorney and to have an attorney present during any questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided for.
Welcome back. A while ago, a video circulated in the Turks and Caicos Islands where a group of approximately 5 law enforcement officers, subsequently identified as border control officers, and for want of a better description, the video depicted them beating the living daylights out of an unarmed and vulnerable man who was later identified as an illegal immigrant. This video has sparked a heated debate for and against law enforcement officers. So the question arises, when can law enforcement officers use force, and when is force justified by law enforcement officers? Now, at common law, in the case of the Queen and Griffiths in 1988, the common law recognized that there may be circumstances in which one person may inflict violence on another without committing a crime. It recognized as one of these circumstances the right of a person to protect him or herself from attack and to act in defense of others, and if necessary, to inflict violence on another in doing so. If no more force is used than is reasonable to repel the attack, such force is not unlawful. If a person holds an honest belief that they or another person is in imminent danger of a violence, then they may use such force as is reasonable and necessary to avert that danger. Therefore, there are 3 core questions for law enforcement officers when they decide to use force. And granted, sometimes this decision must be made in a split second or in the spur of the moment. But one of the considerations would be, would the use of force have a lawful objective, for example, to prevent injury to others or damage to property, or in effecting a lawful arrest? And if so, how immediate and grave is the threat posed? 2, are there other means short of the use of force capable of attaining the lawful objective identified. And 3, having regard to the nature and gravity of the threat and the potential for adverse consequences to arise from the use of force, including the risks of escalation and exposure of others to harm. What is the minimum level of force required to attain the objective identified? And would the use of that level of force be proportionate or excessive? In February 2019, the UK policing minister reiterated before Parliament that in the United Kingdom, any use of force by police officers must be lawful, proportionate, and reasonable in the circumstances. And rules governing the use of force by law enforcement officers are spread across statutory instruments and common law. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, the position is that the guiding principle on the use of force by law enforcement officers will be found at common law. There is thus a subjective and an objective element to the use of force. The question of whether the degree of force used by a person was reasonable in the circumstances is to be decided by reference to those circumstances as that person genuinely and honestly believed them to be. This is so even if their belief is mistaken. Whether the degree of force used in the circumstances as the person believed them to be is reasonable will, however, be assessed objectively by the courts. This issue was addressed in the context of a possible misconduct hearing for an officer in the United Kingdom known as Officer W80 in relation with a police shooting of one Mr. Jermaine Baker in December 2015. Mr. Baker was shot during a foil attempt to enable a prisoner to escape in the context of a sentencing hearing. The Court of Appeal of England and Wales concluded that the Independent Office for Police Conduct, or the IOPC, was justified in concluding that it was open to a reasonable panel at a conduct hearing to make a finding of misconduct if W80's honest but mistaken belief that his life was threatened was found to be unreasonable. That conclusion was soundly based in law and the proper and plain reading of the 2012 Police Conduct Relations and the Code of Ethics published by the College of Policing. Now, further, in the case of HM Advocate and Dorothy, the court identified 3 requirements justifying the use of force. 1, the court says that there must be imminent danger to life or limb of the person using the force. The force the court held must be necessary for the safety of a person using the force, and by this it is meant that the force must both be necessary in the circumstances and should be proportionate to the threat which is being combated. And 3, if the person using the force had any means of escaping or retreating, they are bound to use them, although I hasten to say there's really no obligation to retreat in the face of violence. Now, as a practical example, and this is purely hypothetical, if 4 or 5 law enforcement officers or police officers or border patrol officers confront a suspect or an illegal immigrant, and that suspect or illegal immigrant pulls a weapon, let's say a crowbar, for example, and threatens the officers may use reasonable force to disarm and mitigate the imminent threat by the illegal immigrant or suspect. However, once the suspect or illegal immigrant is subdued or disarmed, any further force or violence towards the suspect or illegal immigrant is unlawful, excessive, unreasonable, and disproportionate. If 5 law enforcement officers disarm or mitigate an imminent threat from a suspect or an illegal immigrant, then proceeded to beat the living daylights out of him while he is unarmed and pose no threat, it's a criminal offense, subject to criminal charges for assault, battery, wounding, or grievous bodily harm if injuries are inflicted during the use of the unlawful force or the use of the unlawfully excessive and disproportionate force. The video that was widely circulated and viewed hundreds of thousands of times, I believe, it is very easy to determine if that level of force was warranted and if it was excessive. It matters not what happened before the force was used. So if the illegal immigrant or suspect was armed before and they were successfully disarmed, then it matters not if force was used when the suspect was of no threat to the officers. Once he was vulnerable and unarmed, and force was used against him, in my view, that force would be unlawful. And the officers who participated in this brazen and unlawful act committed a criminal offense, and criminal charges should be brought against them, and they should suffer the consequences of their illegal actions. On the other hand, there are people who believe that it matters not what the officers did because the person who was subject to that abuse was an illegal immigrant. I beg to differ. The illegal immigrant deserves justice, due compensation, and at the end of it all, due process. Then in my view, he should be duly deported from these islands, never to return. But that is another matter. In response to this incident, there was a press release from the office of the Deputy Governor. And let me just read it briefly. It was circulated on Friday, the 2nd of May, 2025. And it says that as the head of the public service, the Deputy Governor is aware of the video depicting the recent conduct of members of the Turks and Caicos Islands border force. It says all public officers, including those serving within the border force, are held to the highest standards of professionalism and integrity in the execution of their duties. Any actions that appear to fall short of these standards are treated with the utmost seriousness. Accordingly, a comprehensive investigation into the matter has been initiated by both the ministry responsible for border force and the Royal Turks and Caicos Islands Police Force. The governor, the premier, the deputy premier, and the minister responsible for border force, along with members of the cabinet, has been fully briefed and are being kept appropriately informed of developments and actions to be taken. Given that this is an active investigation, it would be inappropriate for me, the office of the deputy governor, or any member of the border force to provide further comment at this time. We remain committed to transparency, accountability, and upholding the values of the public service. Further updates will be provided as appropriate and in accordance with the progress of the investigations. End of the press release. Well, for one, I would like to know, and it would have been helpful if that was included in the press release. I would like to know if these officers are suspended while they are still on active duty, because I believe that this warrants immediate suspension. Here is where I'm going to leave this one for today. If you gain anything from this episode, please like, please share, please comment. Most of all, I thank you for taking your time out to look at this video. Cheers. Bye for now, and I will see you very shortly in another video.